Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, January 13th, 2020, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And I want to give a shout out right at the top to the many, many supporters who make Talk Nerdy possible, who keep it free to download for everybody anywhere who wants to listen to this show. If you want to pledge your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week, I want to give a shout out to some very special people, including Jeffrey Sewell, Brian Holden, David J.E. Smith, the Zombie Drummer, Phil T-Bear, Dudas Infinitas, Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, and I also want to thank somebody special, Mary Neva, but of course she asked that I not give her a shout out, but instead give a shout out to her son who turned her on to Talk Nerdy. So thank you so much to Jim Cooperschmidt, because you're the best. Yes, you are. Actually, everybody listening, you're the best. But special props to Jim. All right, guys, I'm super excited about this week's show because I have the opportunity to have a really detailed chat with Dr. Thomas D. Seeley. He's the Horace White Professor in Biology at Cornell. He's in the Department of Neurobiology and Behavior, teaches about animal behavior, but his research is really focused on the behavior and social life of honeybees. He's written several books and he's won a ton of awards. I didn't even realize this when we spoke, but he received the Alexander von Humboldt Distinguished U.S. Scientist Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Gold Medal Book Award, and he's also been elected a fellow of both the Animal Behavior Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. But he's most proud of having had a species of bee named after him. Yeah, that is like a huge honor. His newest book is called The Lives of Bees, The Untold Story of the Honeybee in the Wild. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Thomas Seeley. Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Cara, to be with you today.
So we are going to be talking about your newest book, The Lives of Bees, The Untold Story of the Honeybee in the Wild. But before we dive into that book, I want to get a little bit of background because, of course, you are the bee guy. You are like the expert in this field. And this is not anywhere close to your first book about bees. You've written, I'm trying to see here, 4 books previous to this one. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Good. Yep. You're well read.
And so the difference between this one specifically is that we are so used to thinking about honeybees and thinking about kept bees, right? Bees in hives that people tend to in order to produce honey, whether it's at like a commercial scale or just like backyard beekeepers. But of course, this species of bee is a wild species that we then utilize. It's not like we bred them to be honeybees.
Yes, the honeybee is an unusual animal that humans have relied on extensively for thousands of years, but we've never been very good at breeding them. And that's because of the one feature of their biology, which is that the matings occur when the queen flies out of a hive and she flies up into the sky and flies off and flies away and then mates with drones from wherever, from other colonies, wherever in the area. So we haven't had the opportunity to tightly breed their biology. So they are, I like to say the honeybee is still basically a wild animal. And we see that very clearly when beekeepers have their colonies living in their hives, but then those colonies in the spring cast swarms of bees. And those swarms fly out and move into the woods and do just fine. So the bees are still very much a self-sustaining wild creature.
Oh, that's so interesting. And it almost seems like it's probably quite good for their genetic diversity that they breed in that way. It seems like it would prevent a lot of bottlenecks or a lot of kind of potential inbreeding.
Yes, it is. That's a very good point. That their ability a queen, when she goes out and mates, it's very important to her that she captures a lot of genetic diversity, and she does that by mating with about 15 different drones. And we now know that the reason it's important for the bees to have a lot of diversity in each of their colonies is it helps them fight diseases. These are insects that live in large groups. They have a lot of diseases, especially of their brood, which are developing in this warm and humid environment inside the nest or hive. And so the bees have to deal with diseases, and one of the key things is to have a lot of diversity among the members of the colony. So this feature of their biology that keeps them wild keeps them healthy too.
Oh, fascinating. So there's so many questions I have about like, the social structure and the hive structure and all that. But maybe before we get into what we know now about bees, we can take a little bit of a step back, like the natural
Mhm.
history
Mhm.
of honeybees, because have we really been keeping them almost as long or longer than we've been, I don't know, trying to domesticate animals?
Uh, we're not sure when the domestication or the keeping of bees, we shouldn't say
Hmm.
domestication, the keeping of bees started. We know that the oldest records we have go back um, about 4,500 years ago. These are paintings in Egyptian temples that show quite sophisticated beekeepers.
Wow.
However, our other animals that have been domesticated, or the start of agriculture and farming, that goes back about 10 or 11,000 years. So somewhere
Hmm.
between those two times. But what humans have been doing with bees goes back to even before we were humans, I think, in that humans have
Hmm.
always tr- greatly enjoyed honey. It was the original source of real sweetness for humans. And so if you look at the other um, great apes, the
Hmm.
gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, they all are honey hunters. They all go out and find nests of bees and steal their honey. And I think humans have been doing that for thousands. We've been around, humans of maybe 300,000 years, modern humans. And I bet all of those times those people were doing just as the other primates do, honey hunting and enjoying the bees' honey.
And so, how did we? I mean, I'm sure you don't know the answer to this question, but it seems like such a dangerous proposition, right? I guess the nutritional value, the high caloric content, and the sweet taste was worth it. But it seems interesting that the first person or the first ape or the first, animal to say, I'm going to brave it. I
Yeah,
don't care
that,
if I get stung.
that's a very good point, because you just have to suck it up. and but you have but the which is quite revealing, in the sense that yes, people were willing to endure the pain of the bee's stings. And we also have from cave paintings these drawings that show people climbing up vines and primitive ladders, sometimes falling off to get up to the nests of bees on cliff sides. So yes, the honey has been a very powerful lure. And that I
Mm,
think it's hard for us to appreciate today, with sugar so plentiful and so easily accessed, just what it was like for people before humans were even farmers to get honey. I mean, we know from the Bible. I don't know if there really was if everything in the Bible is accurate, but um, the Israelites were told that they would be led to a land of milk and honey, and that
hmm.
so honey. I think the flavor of honey has a power which we can't fully appreciate with our today in our world of sugar everywhere.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's not only human beings or the great apes that have kind of utilized honey or realized that honey has such power and such potential. I mean, I'm remembering like that there are African birds that are kind of commonly known as honey guides, which people will utilize to find honey because they themselves are attracted to these beehives.
Yes, that's right. It's the honey guides are go off and they attract the attention of people. And when the honey guides first find a nest of bees, they'll go attract people by making certain sounds, and then the humans have learned to recognize, oh, that's a honey guide. It wants us to, it knows where there's a nest, and then the honey guide will lead the people in steps of about 50 yards, sometimes a little longer, back to the bees' nests. And then the humans play an important role. They open up the nests, which is something the honey guide birds cannot do.
Mm.
And the humans then take out some of the honey and they pull out the combs. But there's a lot of spillage of the brood of the bees and the honey. And I think the birds are particularly interested in the brood, the larvae and the pupae. That's the most
Oh,
nutritious thing
yeah.
for them.
And we're kind of not as interested in that part, or at least not in modern kind of honey production.
That's right. Yep. Yes.
Oh,
But
interesting.
our brains are really wired up, not wild up, wired up to respond to sweetness, and the original that probably evolved originally not for motivating us to get honey, but for enabling us to sense which fruits are the most rewarding, the calorific, which
Yeah.
ones are fully ripe and sweet.
Absolutely. And to kind of counter to that, to avoid anything that might be potentially harmful or dangerous to us, that
Mm-hmm.
might be more bitter in
Mm-hmm.
flavor. It's
Definitely.
so cool to think about that this is a kind of, I mean, obviously, what we know about evolution, and it always bears repeating, is that there's no specific path, there's no guide, there's no end goal, that this is just a series of like strange random mutations and pressures that nature, exhibits at that time for no reason other than what is. But it's always so interesting to see kind of co-evolution scenarios, these ecological scenarios where specific species co-evolved along with other specific species, and there's these complex interplays that are really valuable to all of the organisms involved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, and coming back to what we were talking about earlier, one of the curious things about honeybees is that humans and honeybees have lived together for a long time, but again, because we have not controlled their matings, we've not been able to shape their genetics, and thus there's still an animal that thrives on its all on its own.
Ugh, I love that. There's something almost like romantic about that. That like, these organisms that can't be tamed, and it's kind of like we have the privilege of being able um to benefit from the literal fruits of their labor. Um and it's
Yes.
kind of like a gift that we get because of course they're not being subjugated by us, or they're not submitting to us in a way. It's like a fascinating concept, and it's quite rare, right? When it comes to the human history of agriculture or the human history of animal domestication.
Yes, usually the animals that have been really important to us, we humans have been able to take them in and modify them. Cattle are a great example. There were originally, there's an original aurochsen that is now extinct, and that is the ancestor of all of our modern breeds of cattle. So yes, there were
Hmm.
wild cattle at one time, and but now they've been developed into a huge number of breeds. Both for dairy cows and beef cows. And one thing I would like to stress is that the honeybee is incredibly important to humans, not so much for making honey by any means, but for their uh, pollination services. And that's
Mm-hmm.
been recently documented by this study that had several dozen authors worldwide, and they looked at across all of the countries in the world and all of the crops grown in all of those countries, and then they we're able to get information about for the amount of each crop that's produced, and for each crop, what percentage of the pollination of that crop is provided by honeybees, Apis mellifera, and what percentage is provided by all the other bees. And
Okay.
the estimate they came up with was that 40% of the crop pollination value is provided by honeybees.
Whoa.
47% of the crop pollination service worldwide is provided by Apis mellifera, that one species. So it's a species that's extremely important to humans in ways that greatly far outshadow their value as honey producers, the makers of honey.
Wow. And I mean, my assumption is that something that we didn't even realize when we were first domesticating crops and endeavoring in agriculture, that we kind of felt like, oh, this is cool. We just put the seeds in the ground and then they grow. And we maybe didn't really have a really good grasp of pollination back then.
Yeah, it was when it was done small scale. The pollinators were there in plenty, just in the natural environment.
Hmm.
Today, it's where we have greatly modified in the environment where we produce food in large volumes. There are not the wild areas with supporting enough wild pollinators, the solitary bees as well as honeybees and bumblebees. So we do the honeybees, and now to some extent bumblebees are the pollinators that we can insert into these agricultural systems to provide the pollination.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of wondering about that, and maybe it's something that we can come back to later, but maybe a kind of quick discussion about, obviously the way that we farm now globally is completely different than the way that we farmed when we originally learned how to farm. And that's simply because we have a massive population and we've had to utilize, really sophisticated and honestly life-saving scientific techniques in an effort to feed this growing population, everything from genetic modification of organisms to sophisticated fertilization techniques and things like that. But it does also come with a pretty big cost, right? I mean, the fact that we're not farming in these wild areas and that the organisms that would have been kind of like the facilitator organisms aren't
Mm-hmm.
there. How do we overcome that? Like, what are some of the strategies that agri-scientists use today?
Well, that's a really important topic, and it's one
Mhm.
that's we're wrestling with right now to try to find sustainable ways of both producing the food, and that includes supporting the pollinators, which are involved in many of the vegetables and fruits and nuts that we enjoy. So, what people are trying to do now, among other things, is find ways to reduce the pesticide exposure of honeybees and other insects.
Mhm.
To provide more food for these pollinator insects, because a lot of times the insects ideally will be living in an area uh, all on their own and without humans intervening. But for them to do that, they have to have enough forage and nesting sites. And here's an example that an area that I know well is in New York State, which is a big second largest apple producing state in the United States. There are large orchards and there are small orchards, and the really large orchards need to have pollinators, honeybee colonies brought in. Smaller orchards, however, have enough wild areas on their perimeters and enough wilds for nesting sites for solitary bees and honeybees and bumblebees, and food sources for all those bees that they don't actually need to have humans bring in hives of honeybees to provide the pollination service. So, one of the things we're learning is adjusting, maybe fine tuning the scale of how the scale of the fields and such to make it possible to have the pollinators there all on their own and thus in a more
Mhm.
healthy and sustainable manner.
All right. So, I mean, obviously, I think we're going to be having quite a conversation about the pressures and the difficulties facing the honeybees right now, and what are some of the things that we can continue to do about that. But before we do that, I mean, maybe now would be the time to take a step back and talk about what a honeybee is, how does it live its life in the wild? What do we know about honeybees? I think most people probably, and maybe it's not fair for me to speak for the vast majority of the listeners, but probably know that they're these little yellow and black striped organisms that we see around these hives, and that somehow they make honey. But
Hmm.
I don't think I have, and yeah, I've heard of like that there's a queen bee and that there are worker bees or drones. You mentioned the little grubs or the little larvae
Hmm.
that are in the hive. I'm not sure I fully understand the hive dynamic, the family structure. And,
Yeah.
how do they all work together? And where does honey come from?
Okay. Yeah. Let's start it. This is right. Basically, quick review of the basic biology of a honeybee, uh,
Yeah.
of the honeybees. Uh, I want to start by repeating something you just mentioned, that a colony of honeybees is a family. It is
Okay.
the queen bee is the mother of everybody in the colony, and the colony has workers, which are her daughters, and the colony also has drones, which are the sons of the
Hmm.
queen. And the sex determination system is that when a queen bee lays an egg, if she fertilizes the egg by releasing some sperm onto the egg as it's being produced, it will develop. It'll develop into a female. If the egg is left unfertilized, it develops into a male. So,
And that's her call?
yeah, that's her call. She's got little valves
Huh.
where she can dose out the sperm or not. And inside, bees live in cavities, white boxes in the case of beehives, or hollow trees or caves in the wild. And inside each of one of those cavities, the bees build beeswax combs built of beeswax that hang vertically. And these are these famous combs built with hexagonal cells, and each cell can be used either for storing honey or pollen, or it can be used as a little cradle for producing the young bees, the new bees.
Mm-hmm.
And the typical population of a honeybee colony, well, the size of it would be on the order of it would be, it's typically about 40 liters, which is about 10 gallons. So
Wow.
that's the typical nest cavity size, and the bees will build their beeswax combs in these curtains that hang vertically in the cavity. And in that cavity, be it a hive or a tree hollow, the upper part of the cavity is where the bees stockpile their honey. The lower half of the combs that they've built is where they use for their nursery area, where the young bees are produced.
Mm-hmm.
And within the colony, the worker bees, which are the vast majority of the members of the colony, some 95%, the other 5% being the drones, those bees, they live about 30 days. And as a rough rule of thumb, the first 10 days, they're working as a nurse bee, rearing more bees inside the hive. The next 10 days, they're working as a, a bee that's mostly involved in storing the food and building the combs. And the last third of a worker bee's life is devoted to working outside the hive as a forager, going out and collecting the nectar, which the bees will turn into honey, and the pollen that is their source of fats and proteins. And they will also collect water. Every living organism needs water, and bee colony needs water too. So
Mm-hmm.
these so-called forager bees can go out and collect water as well. So, and that's the basic structure of a honeybee colony. One thing that's unique about honeybee colonies is how they get through the winter in cold parts of the world. All of the other insects, when it gets cold, they become dormant. They'll go into what's called
Mm-hmm.
diapause, where they fill their bodies with some antifreeze material, and then they just let their bodies chill down and even to sub-freezing temperatures. Honeybees are unique. Honeybee colonies are unique in that they fight the cold, and all winter long inside their hive or their tree cavity, they're producing enough heat by using their muscles to generate heat to keep the mass of bees warm. And so they all winter long, the bees are kind of toasty warm inside their nests. And incidentally, that is why bees store up honey. It's not for our pleasure. It's the honey is their winter heating fuel. They will burn through about I've forgotten quite what the numbers are, but in where I am, where the winters are cold, they'll burn through about 20 kilograms or 50 pounds of honey in a winter, so a couple of pounds each week. And the heat production's about 40 watts. So it's inside a
Oh,
hollow
geez.
tree or a beehive. It's almost as if there's a little 40-watt light bulb that's burning all winter long, or it's producing that much heat, and the bees cluster tightly together, and they can make a very well insulated ball of bees, so they can keep themselves warm even when it's very cold outside.
Oh, that's really cool. So to be clear, the honey is what they produce in order to eat, and the
Hmm.
wax is what they
Hmm.
produce in order to kind of have like it's an engineering material. It's what builds
Precisely.
out their house. Okay, so where do both of these things come from? Like how do they actually make honey and wax?
Yes, let's start with the honey. The
Okay.
honey, the honey is made by the bees by going to flowers, and from the flowers they collect nectar. And the nectar is in the flowers because it is the lure that the plants produce in their flowers to cause the bees and flies and other pollinators to come and pollinate the flowers. It's the bees' reward for doing that work. And that's typically, on average, the nectar in a flower is actually quite sweet. It's on average, it's about 40% sugar. And a bee will, if you're a worker bee, you'll go to lots of flowers and you'll collect a, a volume of this nectar. You'll bring it back to the nest. You'll pass it off to other bees inside the nest who are not foragers, some of the middle-aged bees, and they will take that nectar and they will put it up in the honeycomb region of the nest. They'll smear out the load of nectar that they've received from the forager onto the walls of the comb, and there the water can evaporate out quite readily. So, and what they're doing is they're converting that 40% sugar solution up into about an 82% sugar solution. That's honey, and the reason
Ah.
that's not only for economy of space, but when uh, when a sugar solution is that concentrated, it's bacteria and yeast cannot thrive in it. The osmotic pressure is so high that the tendency to dry out things that fall into honey is so strong that it's preserved. It preserves itself very nicely.
Oh, yeah, and that's why you sometimes will hear people talk about the fact that honey has these sort of antimicrobial properties. It's really just that it itself doesn't readily get infected, right?
Yeah, it is antiseptic, just as you said, or
Mm.
antimicrobial, because it just sucks the water out of any microbe that has the misfortune of getting coated with honey. Uh, so yeah, and it is indeed it is an early antiseptic material, or one of the earliest that humans came upon.
Oh, very cool. And that also explains kind of the process by which honey is made, explains why honey from different regions and honey from different flowering sites or different plants have different flavors and different properties.
That's right. Yeah, the flavor is produced not by the bees, but it's produced by the plants and it's usually the flavors of the honey are a carryover of the fragrances that the plants have put into their flowers and thus into their nectar to attract the bees. So, just as we have different flowers that have very different aromas, likewise the honey that comes from different plants has very different kind of aromas of honey.
And you'll hear them like you'll hear different honeys referred to based on those kinds of flowers or based on those kinds of plants, like clover honey or like in New Zealand, manuka honey.
Right. Or yeah, in North America, some of the prized honeys are buckwheat, though some people think it smells like dirty socks. And then there's a goldenrod. There's probably 100 different honey plants in North
Mm.
America, each with its distinctive aroma and flavor of its honey.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So, okay, starting to understand this a little bit better. You've got a mom, and there are a small percentage of the hive are boys, and those male drones are there to basically to get mom ready to lay some eggs,
Hmm.
uh, and
Well,
then you've got
actually,
these worker bees. Oh, does she
just
not lay eggs?
well, no, mom does lay the eggs, but her sons are not going to be fertilizing her.
Oh.
The drones produced in a colony uh, will go out and mate with other queens, but it will be queens from other colonies. They
Oh, and
wouldn't
that helps keep the genetics really,
avoid
diverse.
inbreeding. Yep,
Oh,
exactly.
very cool. So it is their job to mate. That's kind of their whole focus in life, but they are mating with other queens.
That's right. That's a curious feature of the biology of honeybees. It's very important that queen mates with multiple males so that her colony is endowed with great diversity, genetic diversity among the colony's members. That's so important because it means that the colony has a lot of different individuals endowed differently for fighting different sorts of diseases and doing different
Mm.
sorts of jobs. And
Oh, right, because
so,
they're so closely compacted together. It's like constantly living on an airplane. Like you would just be sick all the time.
yeah, that's actually a really good analogy. Yeah, they're living in a space where their air is shared, their food is shared, their living accommodations are shared. It's a parasites or pathogens paradise almost, and so the bees have to do a lot of different things. Another thing that they do to deal with that risk of infections is they collect resins. That was one material I didn't mention earlier. Besides the
Hmm.
nectar and the pollen and the water, they go out and collect tree resins. And trees are making these resins because they're antimicrobial. They'll put them around their buds and things before they open up so the molds and things don't damage the plants themselves. And the bees collect those resins and bring them in, and they'll coat the walls of their nest with or hive with the resins, and they will smear these resins, give a light varnish of the combs, the beeswax combs as well with the varnish, and these are filled with, I say, antimicrobial compounds that the plants are producing and that the bees make use of themselves.
Oh, is this the material that's sometimes used in like alternative medicine? It's called like propolis or propolis?
Yes, that's right. It's called propolis, and
Propolis.
that name comes from the fact that sometimes the bees will reduce the entrance, the size of the entrance opening of their nest or hive by building a wall out of this tree resin, and that's what apparently the Greeks saw that, and that was propolis was a name that they gave to the material, and it means before the
Oh,
city,
wow.
right at
Oh,
the entrance of
cool.
the hive.
Yeah, I love that. Oh, very cool. Okay, so we've got mom, we've got
And
drones that go out and mate with other moms, we've got worker bees that have this 3-tier stage of life.
those are all
How
the
does
daughters. Yeah.
yeah, those are the daughters, and they make the wax, which we'll get to in a second. They make the honey, they make the propolis. Before we get to the wax and how it's made, I'm wondering, how does queen bee become queen bee? Like, how does she get that distinction versus just becoming a regular worker bee?
Yeah. Or to say that even more precisely, how does you take an egg that's been a honeybee egg and it's been fertilized? That's going to produce a female, and the question is, what determines whether that egg develops into a queen or that egg develops into a worker? And
Mm-hmm.
this is a long-standing mystery, and I don't know as we fully understand the mechanism, but it has entirely to do with the environment in which the egg develops. If the larva hatches out of an egg and it is lavishly fed with a material called royal jelly, then it will develop into a queen. If it gets just a smidgen of royal jelly, and then it develops into a worker. So
Huh.
it's all about how a fertilized egg, which will destined to make a female, how it's fed that determines whether it's a queen or a worker.
All right, guys, let's get back to the show. Whoa. And then is the outcome, we know a queen by its behavior, by its role. Is it also physically or physiologically different than worker bees?
Yes, it's both physically, and thus morphologically and
Mm-hmm.
physiologically very different. The weight of a queen is about, I think it's about 150% the weight of a worker bee, so she's bigger and bulkier. And
Mm-hmm.
what's most striking about her is that queen is that her abdomen is bulging with what are ovarials, the
Mm.
structures that produce the eggs. Whereas in a worker, the workers do have a couple of these egg-laying tubes in their abdomens, but they're inactive. Whereas a queen will have several hundred, and so she can lay, and so she's a really productive egg producer. A
Mm-hmm.
queen bee can lay more than 1,000 eggs in a day, and when you think about it, you just go through this simple math, you can see why she has to lay so many. If a colony is going to have 30,000 bees, and each bee only lives 30 days, you're going to have to rear 1,000 bees a day to keep that 30,000
Wow.
colony going. So it's quite an operation.
Oh my gosh. And what happens when queen bee dies? Like, are there other bees that are like next in line?
Yeah, what usually happens, and though it's actually not the topic that's still a bit mysterious, um, somehow the worker bees sense when their mother queen is starting to senesce, they will
Mm.
take steps to rear a replacement, and and so so in colonies, sometimes a beekeeper working through his or her hives will see there's two queens in that hive, and that's mom and
Mm.
one of the daughters, the successor, working side by side. So the colony is um, potentially immortal in that because of that mechanism.
Ugh, that's so neat. Oh my gosh, I'm learning so much. This is so exciting. Okay, so the kind of last component that we didn't get to, I mean, there's a million things we haven't gotten to yet, but in terms of the structure and the function is the actual wax itself. So we know how
Yes,
the
yes.
honey is made. Is what is the wax made out of?
The wax um, is made out of the sugars that the bees consume, and inside in the bodies of worker bees, there are special glands in their abdomens, in the bottom of their abdomens, a series of plates called wax glands, where they can take the carbohydrate from the sugars and convert it into wax. Um, and wax is it's just a different it's a different kind of organic chemical than sugar. So they have to do a lot of fancy organic chemistry inside their body to make these wax molecules, and the bees produce them as little. In bee lore, they're called mere little wax flakes or scales, and on the bottom of a worker bee's body, there are 8 of these little structures. So each bee can churn out 8 wax scales at a time, and then they come out like a little sliver, and they then will bee that's making wax will grab them with her hind leg and pass it to her mid leg, to her foreleg, and then it's where she can then work it with her forelegs and her mandibles and make that little little platelet of wax that she produced, each one into a ball of wax, and then add that to wherever the colony is building its comb. So the bees that are building the comb are not only shaping the building material, but they're also producing the building material itself.
That's so cool. And of course, the wax, like, we talk about honey when we talk about honeybees because, that's what we think of first. We've even called them that, honeybees. But the wax is also a vital kind of commercial product for human use as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know a terrible large amount about that, but its beeswax has certainly has historically had its place. Um, it was one of the very early kinds of plastic materials humans had
Mm.
for sealing things up, for making cosmetics. Um, it was often used for a source of light. The Catholic Church was famous for its use of preferring to use beeswax candles, and so, yeah, it is. It is a one of the original such plasticky type materials. It's been largely superseded by artificial
Yeah.
plastics these days.
Oh, it's really, really interesting. So all of this kind of structure and function that we've been talking about and this kind of innate organization, is this all specific to only honeybees? And follow up, is the honeybee like one species? Is it multiple species? What percentage of all bees are honeybees?
Interesting question. There are, let's see, I think there's about 15,000 species, maybe it's up to 20,000 species of bees worldwide. I'd have to
Okay.
ask my colleague in the entomology department here at Cornell, Brian Danforth. He could answer that question very precisely, I'm sure. Anyhow, so let's say it's 20,000. There are 10 species of honeybees worldwide. These are the 10 species in the genus Apis. That's the honeybee genus. So
Oh, wow.
what's 10 divided by 20,000? That's like, some point oh
Point oh oh oh. Yeah,
oh oh.
exactly.
It's a very small percentage of the world's bee species are honeybee species. That said,
Huh.
as we've talked about, in terms of their numerosity, their abundance, they're heavy hitters in the sense that,
Mm.
as we talked about, of the pollinators uh, in producing our food, nearly 50% of the pollination service is provided by this. Is provided by Apis mellifera, just one of those species of honeybee. So there aren't a lot of honeybee species, but there are a lot of honeybees.
Oh wow. Okay, and Apis. So you said Apis is the genus, and then there are about 10 species within that genus.
That's right. That's right. Yep.
And which is the one that you said Mellifera? What is it called?
Mellifera. That means,
Mellifera.
yeah, that means it's mellifera means is Latin for honey carrying bee.
Hmm.
It should have been, and this was a just the person who named it had his Latin a little bit wrong. It should have been Malefica. He wanted to say the honey maker, but so I should have said Malefica, not Malefera. So just that's a little awkwardness in our nomenclature about honeybees. They're named for being honey carriers, and they don't really carry honey; they make honey. So their name's
Oh
not
my
quite
gosh,
right.
that's
But
so funny. I love that. And is that I'm just Googling it right now. That's what we would also refer to as the Western honeybee?
yes, that's right. That is the Apis mellifera is the honeybee whose range includes Europe, Western
Hmm.
Asia, and Africa. And if you go east of those regions, then you'll come into the other 9 species of honeybees. When you get into
Hmm.
Eastern Asia, um, and yeah, then you will get into the other 9 species, the range of the other 9 species of honeybees.
And what about in the US?
We had we historically we did not have honeybees living in the Americas. Recently, a fossil was found of a honeybee that did live in the Americas, but that was about 17 million years ago. And apparently, it came across, and then it went extinct during a cooling period. But it came across from Asia, just like ourselves, just like humans. It came across the Bering land bridge up in the Bering Strait region,
Hmm.
and but then this fossil was found in Nevada. It's a beautiful fossil. It's very clear. It's a worker honeybee, but it died out. We don't know what its range was, but that was 17 million years ago. And then the honeybee was not present. No species of bee that could be called a honeybee was found in North America until they were introduced by Westerners, from Europeans.
Hmm.
And those the records, the earliest record I know is I think 1622, an introduction to Jamestown, Virginia, and then in 1640 into Boston, Massachusetts. Those were by English settlers. There may have been introductions by Spanish settlers even before that, but nobody's done a good analysis of the bills of lading of the uh, Spanish ships. That's a rich topic for scholarship.
That's interesting. So even though they are wild here in the US, they were actually introduced. So in a way, they're kind of an invasive species.
Yes, they invaded. Humans introduced them, and
Hmm.
shortly after, and they were brought they were brought in ships, sailing ships, during the winter from Europe, England, to North America, and they were living in what are called skeps, these straw hives. And once they got here, they did very, very well in the eastern United States. It was just the eastern United States, with its deciduous forest, is much like their homeland in Europe. In fact, Europe
Hmm.
and North America used to be one continent together, so we share a lot of plants and so forth. And so when the honeybees were introduced to North America, they would go through their normal biology of casting swarms, and those swarms moved into the woods and they spread out. And I talk about in my book that a very nice study a gentleman did, um, uh, Kritsky, uh, where he went back through the diaries and letters of early settlers, and just looking for any mention of people getting honey out of trees and whatnot. And he was able to document the spread over 150 years from the East Coast, the eastern seaboard in the U.S., over to the Mississippi River, and that's pretty fast, actually. So they took to North America very very well, and they were also introduced to South America and Central America. So now the honeybee lives in throughout the New World.
Interesting, and obviously really took over a lot of those kind of pollinating roles that maybe some of the other organisms were filling in prior to that. I guess I'm interested to know. We talked about these really unique dynamics of honeybee life. Are aspects of those common to other species of bees as well, but they just don't make honey? Or like, do other species of bees even live in hives?
The vast majority of 99.9% of the other species of honeybees are what we would call solitary bees.
Mm.
Their life cycle is very individualistic. You have a female that emerges in the that will get mated at some point during the year, and then she will build a nest on her own. It could be in the ground or it could be in a hollow stem. And she'll rear a little family in there, and then she leaves them and she goes off and dies, and then they will emerge the next summer, and so that's how their lives work. And that's the vast majority. That's why we call them solitary. They lead largely solitary lives. Just a
Mhm.
female having mated, caring for a nest with a number of young in them. There are a few other species that are social. Um, in North America, they're the bumblebees, and then in South America, Middle and Central America, and in Africa, there's a whole other group of bees that are a kind of honeybee, but we call them stingless bees. They also, like the familiar honeybees, they live in colonies, groups, and they store up honey to have a food reserve. Uh, but and they're very diverse. I think there's about 500 species of them, but they don't get much press in North America. Because they don't live here. But
Mhm.
they're very fascinating and very compelling, behaviorally compelling social bees. But we just don't hear much about them because we don't see them. We don't have them here.
And what about non-honeybees? Just what we think of as like regular bees, that 20,000 species that you talked about before. Are they social? Do they have some of these same kinds of lifestyles?
Some um, they're very diverse in terms of their
Okay.
lifestyles. None of them have the large colonies and that we have in 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 honeybees, Apis mellifera. Um, there are a few species in which there's a little overlap of a couple of several females will work together and share a nest, and so they're social in that sense. And we have the bumblebees where the those bumblebees are truly social like honeybees, but their colonies are not as large. And when I
Mm.
say truly social, I mean that they have a queen who makes a nest and has daughters that stay with her and don't reproduce, but are her helpers, just like in honeybees. So
Mm.
bumblebees are the closest, in terms of their social biology, are the closest to honeybees. But their
That's
colonies are small, and they're very well adapted to cooler climates. They don't overwinter by storing up honey and keeping warm all winter long. They instead, with bumblebees, it's the queens produced at the end of one summer burrow down into the ground below frost level, I think, and then will spend the winter in solitude and then pop out in the spring and start things over.
So, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, obviously, you have dedicated your life to learning about honeybees and their, fascinating ecology, their fascinating physiology. There's so many aspects of it. How social they are, is that not like just unique among organisms? I mean, it seems to me, especially among insects, that it's such a sophisticated um strategy for maintaining the species that I mean it's almost hard to believe when you really start to dig into it.
Yeah, you've put your finger on a really important point, and so I'll answer. I want to address a couple of thoughts that bubbled up when you were just raising this point. One is that first of all, yes, the fascination of honeybees is their sociality. They are what I would call beautifully social insects, and that is also the secret to their success. They can thanks to their social system, they can get through cold winters. They can stockpile food. They can thwart enemies. They can, yeah, they do all these lead these very sophisticated lives. However, they are not the only highly social insects by any means. In fact, they're if we shift from away from bees over to ants, and the
Mm.
other major group of social insects, there we find even, you might have to say, even more spectacular animal insect societies. And those have been so beautifully described by Edward O. Wilson and Bert Hildobler in their books. And so they've devoted their lives to the study of ants, as I've devoted mine to study of bees.
Ugh, I love that, and you guys have been able to share those stories with, with people like us, like myself, and those who are listening, who obviously may not. We can watch them, we can watch nature documentaries about them, we can spend time near them, but may not ever have the kind of appreciation that you have because you're studying them from so many different angles. So it's like a real honor to be able to learn about them through your work.
Thank you. It's for me, it's a real it's an honor to have been able to make a living making discoveries of how these honeybee colonies work and how they live in the wild. So it's I feel like a very lucky human being to have had this opportunity to work this closely with this one really just utterly it really is just an amazing, it's an amazing insect. I mean, one of the things that makes it so amazing is their ability to communicate. It's the only insect that where an individual can give another individual instructions to say, go out to that location, and here's the instructions. Go to that direction and that distance, and you'll find a rich food source. Um, that's there's only the only other species that can do that is the honeybee and ourselves, and maybe some ospreys. But that kind of thing makes it makes it really just utterly fascinating for me and for all of the other people that are study bees, either professionally or as a beekeeper. And there's lots and lots of people that have been captivated by the bees, and so captivated they keep them in their backyards, in their hives.
Yeah, I mean that's incredible. And what is their language based on? Obviously, it's not linguistic language, but what is their communication style? Is it through um, dance?
Yeah,
That's a
that's right.
dumb
That's
thing
what
to call. Is it dancing?
it is called, the waggle dance, and it is
Oh, I love that.
performed. It's performed inside the nest by a bee that has found a rich source of pollen or nectar or water if the colony's thirsty. And it's a little hard to explain in words without making a drawing, but basically she does a ritualized reenactment of her flight out to the flower patch on inside the nest on the combs. And so it
Huh.
involves her walking forward on the combs, and she can indicate the distance by how long she walks forward while making a buzzing sound with her wings. So the greater the distance, the longer each run of her, what we call the waggle dance, lasts. So and that waggle run can last from a fraction of a second up to several seconds, and so that can code the distance. And then how she indicates the direction is by the angle. She's doing the dance on a vertical surface, the side of one of these curtains of comb in the nest. And if she's doing her waggling motion or her dance while she's walking straight up, that she's telling the other bees that the target of flowers that she's indicating is in the direction of whatever direction the sun currently is. So the bees
What?
Yeah, so it is remarkable. It really is a unique, abstract form of communication. And when it was discovered, it was so striking. The original person who discovered it, a gentleman named, very good scientist named Carl von Frisch in Germany, he didn't fully understand it himself for 20 years. He thought he sort of had these, I wouldn't say blinders on, but he assumed that the bees were doing something much simpler than they were. But finally, did some experiments that revealed to them, oh, these bees in their communication system, they have words for distance and direction. And then he looked closely and he figured out how it works. So yeah, it's that kind of social beauty of social life, which is compelling to me, and I think is compelling to um, most beekeepers and other honeybee biologists.
Oh, it's absolutely incredible. And of course, you mentioned previously that the sociality and really the communication um, that's unique is also really the key to their success as a species, and that they have been quite a successful species, accounting for almost half of pollination. That said, we also know that human activities, as is so often the case, are really threatening the honeybee right now. So I would love to maybe take the last bit of our chat to talk about what some of the threats that these organisms might be facing. What's the difference between the threats that kept bees are dealing with versus what's going on in the wild, and kind of what can we learn from these bees?
Yeah, that's these, and you've put your finger on a really important subject regarding the human being honeybee relationship right now. We're doing a number of things that uh, with the bees that are living under our management in beekeepers' hives. We're doing a number of things that are making life harder and harder for these beautiful bees. One is very simply described. We're spreading poisons in the environment, using lots of pesticides in the fields where the bees are brought to do their pollination work, and that's a deadly combination of bringing bees in and then spraying the fields with insecticides. These would be spraying in orchards and things like that. So that's one combination. Another is that
Mhm.
uh, we're we've introduced um, some parasites, uh, particularly a little mite from an Asian species of honeybee was introduced to the European and African species of honeybee, and this little mite is very good at
Mm.
transmitting the bees' viruses. It's a great vector for some nasty viruses of the bees, and that's probably been an equally bad killer of honeybee colonies, both managed colonies and wild colonies. Um, so that's another thing that we've done to make life hard for honeybees. And then there's a long-standing aspect of the human being honeybee relationship is that we've always been uh, unintentionally and thus inadvertently, um, we've been making life hard for them by just putting them in hives and managing the colonies to be very productive of honey. Um,
Hmm.
it's a complicated topic, but there's a lot of things about the life of a honeybee colony that are made more difficult when they're living under human management. Here's just one example. Beekeepers for and I'm a beekeeper. For our convenience, we put our hives together in groups, which are called apiaries or bee yards, and
Mhm.
that's convenient for the human being. But for the bees, it's not so great because it means if one colony gets sick, the illness, the pathogen or parasite that's causing that illness, spreads easily to the other colonies, which can be just a few feet away. So that's not good for the bees, and that's very different from how they live in the wild, where they're
Mm.
usually living about half a mile apart from between one hollow tree housing a bee colony and another. You know,
Mhm.
so another is that as we so often do with agricultural animals, we manipulate them to be extremely productive for the things that we want. In the case of honeybees, guess what that is? It's honey. So
Yeah.
a lot of the technology and skill of beekeeping or trade of beekeeping is making honeybee colonies into very large units, having the colonies grow to a larger size than they would in nature. Instead of growing to 20 or 30,000, to they grow up to 60,000 or even more bees, so they have a huge workforce, so they can make, and then they will
Huh.
store up lots and lots of honey. So that means that the colonies are even more prone to diseases because they've got all these resources inside them for the parasites and pathogens to exploit. So that's another thing that we do. And then another third thing, one that we see very dramatically in North America, is we we ship. I think it's close to 2/3 of the honeybee colonies in North America are transported every spring from wherever they are, whether it's in Florida or New York State or um, wherever, out to California, into the Central Valley of California for the almond pollination. And
Mm.
that is just very hard on the bees. And I think statistically, only about half the colonies that are taken out to those almond orchards are healthy when they come out, or are still
Wow.
alive when they come out, because there's just so much spread of disease. And the trip itself is apparently pretty hard on the bees. It's being trucked thousands and thousands of miles. Um,
Gosh, I had no
so
idea. I knew almonds were, like, really intensive when it came to water usage, and that was always something that was like, "Ooh, I don't know if almond milk is the best alternative." But I had no idea what kind of an impact, almond farming had on bees.
yeah, almond production is not only water intensive, it's bee intensive. It needs
Ugh.
every yep, every flower, if it's going to make a fruit or a seed, a nut, has to have a pollinator um, show up and move the pollen from one plant to another. So yeah,
Mm.
it's really hard. All beekeepers love their bees, but they don't always. They're not every action that beekeepers take is what you would have to say is a loving or caring action, even though, and that's something we're just starting to realize, because one of the curious things about honeybees and bees and beekeeping is that it's only in about the last few decades that we've known anything about the natural lives of bees. See,
Yeah.
beekeepers developed hives starting thousands of years ago, as we talked about, and we've never. And once human beings got bees in hives, then they focused on their lives of the bees in the hives and how to manipulate them and how to, you know, I'd have to say, honest, exploit the lives of these bees living in the beekeepers' hives. Where those could be boxes or skeps, whatever, log
Mhm.
hives, whatever. So our focus is almost every beekeeper's focus has always been on the bees living in his or her hives, which is very unnatural. And so now we've gone back and looked at how bees are living. And Wendell Berry put it really nicely. I'll paraphrase one of his famous quotes, and he was referring to agricultural practices in general. He says, "We've never really known what we were doing because we've never known what we were undoing. And we only can know what we're undoing if we would see what nature is doing if we were doing nothing." And that's so
Yeah.
apt for bees and beekeeping. Beekeepers don't know what we're doing to the bees because we haven't known what we were undoing, because we didn't know what their natural lives were like. But that's what I and others have been looking at intensively for, as I say, for the past about 40 years now.
And that really ultimately is kind of the thesis of your new book, The Lives of Bees, the untold story of the honeybee in the wild. Because in understanding kind of the success of this species in the wild, we can actually learn from them and maybe apply some of those strategies that have been, honed by hundreds of thousands, millions of years, um, and utilize them in our beekeeping.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's one of the things the ideas that I present in this book. It's not going to be this idea of letting bees live more naturally. Probably will not, well, certainly will not apply to the commercial beekeeper with thousands or tens of thousands of hives of bees, but it's very relevant to the hobby beekeeper that might have a handful of colonies where they can they don't need the high production. They're not trucking their colonies around. They can give the bees, let them live kinder, gentler lives. And so I think that's one of the positive aspects of this growing body of knowledge of the natural lives of bees. And most beekeepers are small-scale beekeepers, are hobbyists, and they have the bees' interests first and foremost. That's for them. It's a lot like, I like to compare what I see as the two kinds of beekeeping, and it's like the difference on the one hand you've got the small-scale beekeeper, and on the other hand you've got the large commercial, and it's much like the difference between people that enjoy watching birds or bird watchers and people that grow birds for eggs and meat and poultry farming. And I think there's certainly room for both of those approaches, and they're very different. And they're both. I think they're both valid, but we have to recognize that there are these two ways of working with the bees, not just managing them for maximum honey production or maximum pollination value, but it's perfectly valid to enjoy a colony of bees just as a living system. It is beautiful in its own right, even if it makes no honey or produces only its pollination inadvertently.
Yeah, they are intrinsically fascinating, just being themselves. And of course, you've shared those stories so beautifully in your book. Tom, sorry. Before we wrap up this chat, I close every episode of my show by asking my guests the same two questions. And they're sort of big picture questions. So you could obviously take a moment to think about your answers. But I would really love for you to weigh in, especially considering the unique perspective that you bring to the conversation. So, okay, if you're ready, here they come. Number one, when you think about the future in whatever context is kind of relevant to you, it could be contextualized by the work that you do, by where you are along the developmental process of life. It could be a personal thing, a vocational thing, even a cosmic thing. Number one, what is the thing that really does keep you up the most at night? The thing that you're most worried about? Maybe you're getting to be borderline, I don't know, pessimistic, cynical, something that you're like, this is not okay. And on the flip side of that, what is the thing that, if you had to pick one, that you're like genuinely, authentically, actually optimistic about? You're very much looking forward to.
Well, the first one's easier because it's so
Okay.
obvious. It's just the pervasive damage to our planet, loss of water, rising temperatures, pollution with pesticides and everything else. So that's the one that keeps me up at night. I mean, I'm almost 70 years old, and I can just see it. It's so obvious. When I was a kid, the fields were filled with insects, and now they're not. You go out in the summer evening, the thing would be a symphony of insects, and now you don't see that. You don't hear that. Don't see that. What gives me hope or optimism? What gives me hope and optimism is knowledge. We're learning more and more about where we're going wrong, and that's of course the first step. Knowing what we're doing, knowing what we're undoing, is the first step towards, I think, to getting it back, to figuring out how to stop doing that, and be more benign to our planet, and thus ultimately to ourselves and to our children.
Absolutely. What a beautiful and elegant response to those questions. Well, Tom, thank you so very much for coming on the show today. I have learned so much. I know I still have a million questions, but I feel like my basic questions have been answered. Everybody, the book is The Lives of Bees, The Untold Story of the Honeybee in the Wild by Dr. Thomas D. Seeley. Thank you so much for joining me. It was just an absolute blast.
Thank you, Cara, for having me. It's been really my pleasure. It's a great show, and I'm really glad I could contribute to it.
Oh, I'm so glad. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we can all get together to talk nerdy.